afternoon. Thank you for coming here today. I know some of you are still getting pizza, but we have a lot of good material to cover, so I don't want to lose time. We have a spectacular faculty member today who I'm so lucky agreed in her busy schedule, and she'll tell you in a few moments why it's going to get 100 times busier in 24 hours. So Beth has been a dear colleague and friend since I arrived here at Michigan, and she's been one of the most welcoming people I've known here. So I'm so glad that she is going to be talking to us today on a very important topic. And if you guys see at the end of your tables, there'll be a handout that Beth actually created custom for this particular event. It's pretty spectacular, so thank you for doing that. My pleasure. And Ali, who is a postdoc in the same department, will be moderating the event. So Ali will take it off and ask Beth a few questions and walk you guys through this nice handout. Maggie told me to make an important announcement, which is that everything that you're eating on or eating with is compostable, and there's a compost bin on this side of the room, so please use that. Thank you.
Thanks guys for coming today. So as she mentioned, you have the outline in front of you, which I think will be good for facilitating conversation today, what we should be talking about. And I also have a list of questions that people have submitted, so if we have any moments of silence, I've highlighted some ones I'll be bringing up, but if people are willing to just keep asking questions, then we'll just keep doing that method until the end, and we'll leave about 5 or 10 minutes at the end so that we can just touch on that list that you have in front of you, any of the points that might have not been addressed during the question and answer session. So with that, this is Dr. Moore, who is acting as the chair of immunology and microbiology currently. And I'd like to...
I like the reverse order, immunology and microbiology.
Just for you.
Thanks.
So first I'm just going to ask her to explain her background and hit on any points that are particularly relevant to the discussion today.
All right, my pleasure. I'm excited to be here. It's really quite overwhelming to see how many people are here. If you cannot hear me, just raise your hand. I want to make sure you can hear. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Texas. I went to the UT Austin for my undergraduate, majored in microbiology. Thought I wanted to go to graduate school to study cancer. Knew so little about graduate school that I thought I would have to pay out-of-state tuition if I went out of the state of Texas, so I only applied to graduate school in Texas. Fortunately, UT Southwestern in Dallas is a pretty good school, and I did get in there. To be perfectly honest, I did not get in there initially, but they had somebody who was accepted above me cancel at the last minute, and because I was a Texas resident, they called and asked if I would come. I had actually already booked an apartment and put money down on an apartment at a different university in Texas. So that'll tell you about how much I felt I belonged there. I remember in my interviews there, they asked me if English was my native language because my maiden name was French, which I thought was interesting. So yeah, kind of a weird school, but actually I had a wonderful experience at UT Southwestern. The one thing about it is it's just a freestanding medical school, so what you don't get is all the interactions with all the other kinds of departments and other schools that a big campus gives you. Just to be clear, I married my husband during graduate school, so we met when I was a second-year graduate student. He was first-year graduate student. We got married in my fourth year of graduate school and had decided not to have children. But that didn't work out quite the way we planned because then I got pregnant the next year. And so I had my first child 5 months before I defended my PhD. I'll tell you, if you're interested in that, I'm happy to talk about that later. I think it's a good thing that it happened that way because I don't know if I would have been able to go back to work, except I was so close to getting that degree. Then I did a short postdoc at UT Southwestern while my husband, who was behind me in the graduate program, finished. We had another child, so I have 2 children, and then when my kids were 2 years old and 3 weeks old, we moved across the country to California to start a postdoc at Stanford, and I'm happy to talk about all the good and bad of all the imposter syndrome that came up. We were so incredibly poor that at those times you could still work a part-time job as a graduate student and as a postdoc, so I did have part-time jobs the whole time. I was a graduate student and a postdoc. But I'll be perfectly honest, when my 3-year time was up at Stanford, because it was, you've got a 3-year postdoc and at the end of it you had to leave, that was all there was to it, I was not marketable for a tenure track job. I had an offer for industry, but I really wanted to try to do academics. And we had Gary Huffnagel, for those of you who know, happened to go to graduate school with us. We've been friends for 35 years. He was here already, and he let Tom and I know that there would be the possibility of research track faculty positions in pulmonary. So we came here for research track faculty positions in 1997, and then I worked my way up through the research track faculty to eventually, I was hired in medicine, which is a clinical department, and they didn't even have tenure track for PhDs when I first came in 97. Once that became a possibility, I worked my way over to the tenure track and up, and now I'm tenured in medicine, and am now, I joined microbiology and immunology as a joint faculty member about 10 years ago. And as you just heard, the regents are voting on me today. So apparently, if all goes well, I will officially be the interim acting chair for microbiology and immunology this afternoon. And many of you in this room know that I've run the graduate program in immunology here for the last 7 or 8 years. So I've been here my whole career, but I've had a very non-traditional path, and I'm happy to answer any questions related to that. So,
does anybody want to start us off?
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about like research track positions that were not like tenure track positions, and what those entailed and how you navigated?
Yeah, so in fact, we can have a whole separate workshop sometime if you want to about research track faculty, because it's a difficult position, and I am absolutely, completely understand what that challenge is. I mean, I think, to be perfectly honest, the University of Michigan doesn't really recognize research track faculty. I mean, they recognize that you're faculty in that they will allow you to write a grant. And that's really what the only benefit, in some ways, of that position is. But you are still affiliated with someone else. You don't get your own lab space. You don't get your own office, generally. All of those things are kind of terrible about it. But what the research track faculty did, I mean, for me, the way that I use it, and this is the way I talk to my research track faculty in my lab about it, is it's a hunting license. It basically buys you time to get your CV in order, to show productivity, to learn new skills, to develop a CV that makes you more competitive, and it gives you the opportunity to at least submit a grant. So at Stanford, you were a postdoc or you were tenure track faculty. There was nothing else. I don't know if that's still true today, but when I was there was no in between. So I wasn't competitive to get a tenure track job coming out of my postdoc. I mean, I had 2 little kids and I was working a part-time job, and in some ways it's kind of crazy thinking back on it. But coming here in a research track job, in part, I was lucky in that I had fairly supportive mentors who allowed me to work hard and build up that CV, and then allowed me to have something that I could write a grant on. And then once I had a grant, then that gave me a little bit more leverage, frankly, in the negotiations to keep moving up. So I think there's a lot of downsides to being a research track faculty. The thing that has to work is you have to hopefully have a supportive mentor who's willing to support your independent career development as well, and we can talk about that if you want to. But I think what you really have to look at it as a hunting license, a time to build your own CV and an opportunity to write for grants and hope for the best. And then usually I think it would work better to go somewhere else. I mean, that's the other thing. My husband's also faculty here too, so 2 jobs at the same place at the same time definitely created some challenges as well. But I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm happy to answer more about that.
So follow up to that is several people wanted to know, is it required to have a grant in order to be eligible for a lot of these faculty positions? And then how do you know when you are ready to start?
Yeah, I'm very happy. So for sure, if you go, so there's really 2 ways to get a faculty position, basically. So one possibility, you absolutely, if you are lucky enough to be a real superstar postdoc where you go to a lab, things work well, in that time frame. So let me just talk about it. One thing you can do as a postdoc is write for a K99R00. But to be clear, to be eligible for that, what that really means is that you have to write for that grant in your 3rd year of postdoc, so that, because you're only eligible till year 4, and you'd like to have a chance to submit it twice and be able to get it back. So I will be honest, not that many people are so successful in their first 3 years of postdoc that they can write a grant, have the preliminary data, and have a great idea that they can take with them that is not going to directly compete with their mentor. So if you are lucky enough to be in that situation, you should absolutely write for a K99, and a K99 definitely opens doors for postdocs. Now, you may have a hard time staying at the university where you are. You may have to be willing to move. And I will tell you that when I do a lot of counseling of people looking for jobs, that's when people who are able to move often have much better chances finding positions than people who are landlocked for one reason. That's just the nature of the thing. If you're willing to move to North Dakota or to Minnesota or wherever, and move away from your family, then there's always the opportunity to maybe find a position there. And I didn't mean to disparage those states. I was just like somewhere farther away from. That was not even disparaging. I just meant that that's somewhere farther away from Ann Arbor. If you have a super high impact paper, it absolutely will open some doors for you, and you may be able to get a bona fide tenure track job offer just by putting your name out, applying for the jobs that are available, going on the circuit and interviewing. And if you, in that case, if you've got a really good idea to go forward and the school can see that, you've got good collaborative interaction potential with the people that are there. Because a lot of times what matters about when the school makes you an offer is how well you fit in with what they're looking for. I mean, that, you should remember that it's not always that you weren't a good candidate, it's that they need a bacteriologist and you're a virologist or something like that, So if you're lucky enough to do that, you can get it without having a grant. If that 4-year time frame passes and you don't have those things, then there's no question money opens doors, because it proves two things. It proves you've got good ideas, it proves that peer review likes what you do, and it proves that you can write a grant. Those are major things for being a good faculty member. And so if you can be in a research track faculty position and get a K-22 or a K-01 or hopefully an R-21 or an R-01, you will be, when you apply for the jobs that are posted, your application will rise to the top compared to the 75 or 100 other ones that may not have that funding. So funding will open doors, and there's no question about that. So you definitely don't have to have it, but I think to not need it and be able to get a position, you need to get a little bit lucky, and you need to have a project that either gets published high impact somewhere as a big splashy something, or you have a fancy technique that you can take somewhere else. Those are the kinds of things that will help you get a job without having money. Does that make sense?
So touching on the high impact publications, several people were asking, and I think that's one of your bullet points on the sheet here, which is don't leave your data unpublished.
Absolutely.
So this is relevant for both graduate students and postdocs.
Absolutely.
People were asking about what if your publication record's not as competitive, or and what do you think is more important, the quality of the papers that you're publishing, or the quantity, or is there some balance between the two?
So I have a lot of thoughts about this. My first thought is that all your papers should be quality. Quality does not equate with impact factor of where they're published. Every paper you publish, you better be proud of the data, it better be solid data. Do not publish anything that you do not consider quality. But you can publish a quality paper in PLOS One, you can publish a quality paper in the Journal of Immunology, and you can publish a quality paper in Nature. You can also publish a terrible paper in any of those places. So I think it should always be quality. I sit before you having never published a Cell, Science, Nature Immunology, Science Immunology, none of those papers are on my CVs. I still hope that we'll get one day. I'm really proud of the fact that some of my graduate students who've left my labs have gotten those papers in their postdoc labs, but they haven't gotten them for me. So I'm hoping that that's for training. I mean, I will not lie to you. There is a group of people, I think they're in the minority, but there's a group of people for which those kinds of publications matter. And they carry a lot of weight, and if you're lucky enough to get one of those, it will open doors for you. If you are not in a field that happens to get that kind of publication, because let's face it, some of it is field specific. If you're not in that kind of field, or if you just didn't happen to get lucky enough to do that, then the next best thing is to publish a lot of papers. And I personally believe, I think I said on here, I am one of the papers that I am the best known for. If you were to go and ask my pulmonary colleagues, what did Beth do that makes her well known in the pulmonary fibrosis field? It was a CCR2 knockout mouse paper published in the Journal of Immunology. That currently has an impact factor less than 5. But that paper has been cited something like 400 times or something. That is the work I am most well known for. It's not a high impact paper. But if you look, you can definitely see a trajectory of the work that I've done over the years. And I think that's what you have to think about, is you have to think about building a body of work. So I think you can always try, shoot for the high impact paper, try to get the data for it as long as you can. And to be perfectly honest, the best time to get that is as a graduate student, because that's where you have the most time to do it. But if it doesn't work out, shoot like crazy for it in the first 3 years of your postdoc. But I personally think if you're coming up on year 4 of your postdoc, it's better to start talking to your mentor about publishing a couple of papers or publishing a review in a paper, because you really have to have track record. The thing that will kill your chances at a faculty position more than anything else is a CV that has nothing on it, because a reviewer cannot tell the difference between whether you were doing great work that just hasn't quite gotten out yet or whether you did nothing. And so I think that my real mantra is that you either have to, go for high impact. Please always try. It's always worth trying. But, there has to be that fine line that is really a conversation between your mentor about when is it not in your best interest anymore? When is it important for you personally to leave? And I personally, my lab has run on graduate students over the years. I've had far more graduate students than I've had postdocs over the years. Graduate students need to learn to write. I personally think there's a lot more training in a graduate student writing 3 or 4 papers than there is in maybe that one big paper that's got so much data from other people. So I absolutely do not think that the message is that you have to have those high impact papers. I think absolutely they open doors for you and they matter to some people. But I promise you, I'm here today and I've never had one.
So another thing you said, which I thought was really important and I actually haven't heard brought up very often, is your very first point, which is read, read, read. So people were asking about, with the reading, how that affects your grant writing, paper writing, and then like how do you devote your time, I think, as a graduate student or a postdoc? You feel like you're sometimes getting pulled 1,000 different ways. So how do you stay organized enough and make sure that you devote that time to reading?
So I'll tell you that one of the things that I've always thought was interesting is it's hard to make yourself read because it's very easy to find everything else to do instead of doing that. But I have to say the reason I think if I've been successful as a faculty member, one of the reasons is because there is something enjoyable to me about writing a grant. And usually part of what's enjoyable about it is that you usually block off time to go read a bunch of papers in that area and try to catch up, right? Because you definitely don't want to write the background of your grant and not cite the most current paper in that field or whatever. I'm always amazed at when I go through PubMed, do the search, download 30 papers that I'm going to try to read, block off 4 days, sit in my, usually at home actually because I can't get it done at home here at the office. When I read that kind of body of literature, I'm always furious at myself at all the stuff that's out there that I missed. And also, it's definitely a way to get ideas. So I think that there's something enjoyable about reading. And definitely, I think one of the points that I made is if you get stuck, if you're like, how do I move to the next field? Where do I go? Send yourself to the library, download 12 papers, and read and see if you get an idea from it. Because I really think that's where the ideas and the interest comes. You can usually find some way to, take this antibody that they used or pivot or something that you read about in this cell line might work in your cell line. That's really where the spark of ideas comes from. Or going to seminars. I also think going to seminars is another great way to get ideas and think about it. So what I tell people, I think a reasonable goal is to read 2 papers a week. And then the other thing is to try to remember what you read them because you're not going to remember that. And so if you do it electronically, try to put some comment boxes on it. And then I have tried to start filing my papers on my on my computer into folders. This is about chemokines and fibrosis. These are about icosanoids and fibrosis. These are about diabetic wound healing or whatever, different projects we have so that I'm trying to get the papers there because it is hard to go back and find them. But then if you get an idea, this is maybe my most important advice, is if you come up with an idea, put it on a list and put the list over your computer or wherever you work. And do not think you're going to remember the idea. At least when you get to my age, you cannot remember what you talked about on Monday when you get to where my students are sitting there and they will guarantee that this is true. Put it on a list. For a long time when I was an assistant professor, I had a list of ideas that was, 10 or 15 or 20 different things on the list. I hadn't gotten to all of them yet, but every time I had an idea, I wrote it down. And going back and looking at that list over and over again really helped me stay focused or helped me remember what I could do. Or when you had 6 extra mice that you didn't know what to do, it's like, I can do that experiment with those mice. So I think that kind of organizational prompt helps.
So we talk a lot about the academic things for faculty track, but how important are outreach and other I guess, like extracurricular activities to your faculty application?
Yeah, so I would love to tell, so it's good news and bad news, right? So I will tell you that a lot of universities, almost all universities, are really looking for faculty members who know how to engage with a wide variety of learners. So outreach activities, DEI activities, volunteering, tutoring, all of those kinds of things that you do, those are the kinds of things that say to a university, I work well with different kinds of people, this is important to me. All of that is good feeling. But I hate to tell you that none of that can replace the science part of it, unfortunately. So all of that is just frosting on the cake, and I think that those things help. And especially when it comes to like writing a teaching philosophy or something like that, I think those kinds of activities play very well into that. Some universities now are asking you to write a diversity statement, and so those extracurricular activities can really help there. And I will say that there's a big difference between somebody who writes a diversity statement that is completely not about what really they're looking for. When they're asking for a diversity statement or whatever, they're asking about how do you work with different kinds of people. What kinds of activities or seminars or workshops or things have you done that prove that you can work with a lot of different kind of people, that you're an open-minded person, that you accept people of all different colors, races, whatever. That's what they're looking for. They are not asking you to talk about, sometimes diversity statements come through. It's funny, I was on a panel for EEB, and they talked about their travel and stuff, and souvenirs they had bought and things like. It was really very off base, So that kind of stuff, it can give you help in those pieces. But I think the truth of the matter is most universities are going to be hiring you for your science. And in fact, as much as I would love to say, a small liberal arts teaching school will care about your teaching experience and your teaching philosophy and that kind of stuff. And they do not want you just to have been a TA where you graded. They want you to have actually been a TA where you developed curriculum or some pedagogy of the class where you really helped do that. For a small liberal arts school or a school where you're getting paid to teach and research is sort of the frosting, then the teaching piece becomes much more important. But I have to sadly admit that at a school like the University of Michigan, your teaching will not matter to them. I mean, on main campus more so than in the medical school, but in the medical school you're going to be getting hired because of your science and what you can do there. And they're going to hope that you're a good teacher. And they're going to provide some CRLT training and all, and hope that you'll do that. But it is not, in a big R1 research university, that is not valued like it should be. I disagree with that, but it is the truth, I think. Yeah?
So running down the list, but in a similar vein, question 5 is talking about mentoring and seek mentoring. So by the time that we get to the point of that year 2, 3, 4 postdoc, a lot of us have pretty extensive mentoring experience and have had successful undergraduates that we've mentored. Mm-hmm. What do you think the best way to communicate that in an application package or a grant package is? Because I always struggle with that. Where do I put that in?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that comes down to teaching philosophy. That's where I think you talk about, in your laboratory-based teaching. I think what is important is for you to talk about whether, or at least let me say what I've seen, the successful faculty applications that I've seen where they've talked about this stuff. It's usually where they talk more about how they helped the student design an independent project, and then they talk a little bit about how they helped mentor the student through the challenges of the project. Much more so than the ones that come through and it's more like I taught this student how to do PCR, they did all my PCR reactions for me and I made them third author on the paper. So I think what you want to do is talk about the process of mentoring, about what you found, and then sometimes about what you found challenging or what you found rewarding about that experience. And especially what they love in those kinds of things is if you did something, like if there was some roadblock that you figured out some creative way to help the student get over. That's the kind of thing to talk about in those teaching statements or your mentoring statements that you write as part of your application. So I think it's a little bit more important than the results that the person got. I think you want to think about writing about the process. Does that help answer that?
As a follow-up to that, so mostly in graduate school and postdocs, I think most of us are mentoring undergraduate students, and you can definitely learn a lot about how to mentor different people. But how is that different from when you're in faculty now? You're going to be mentoring also graduate students and postdocs and senior scientists and all sorts of, can you apply the general same principles, or do you feel you need to try to find other sources for experience while you're training?
Yeah, so I guess just a few thoughts, and I think this is true at any level. I mean, my feeling about undergraduates is that if they are putting time and effort in and are helping, are really invested in it, and you're finding the experience rewarding and they're useful to you, then I think that's worth putting your time and effort into. The minute that that is not true, then that is the kind of thing you want to say no to and find something else. There are plenty of people who want to work in labs that are going to work hard for you, work well for you, put time and effort into it. So my general piece of advice is you should not waste your time on people who are not giving it their full effort. Science is a competitive field. They should learn from the get-go that if they're not willing to be, engaged and put effort in, then better for them to move on to business or something. I don't know. As far as mentoring, I think it's very hard to mentor. I think mentoring is a very difficult skill. What I will say, I think a mistake I see happen often is that new faculty members come in and the first thing they want to do is hire a postdoc. And a postdoc agrees to work for that new faculty member. That is generally a difficult circumstance because a new faculty member, every single idea that they have that is possibly fundable, they need to fund it themselves. They need to write that grant for themselves. What a postdoc needs is to be able to develop something that they can take away from that lab. A postdoc who wants to be faculty has to develop something that they can take away. By definition, they are taking something away. So as you look for postdocs, if you want to be in academics, it's probably a better idea for you to look at bigger labs, more senior labs, more well-funded labs who have something to give away. A brand new assistant professor, you might be able to go there and learn a super cool technique, but there's a very good chance that if you do manage to get a faculty position, you're going to be competing with them. And you're not going to be as good at it probably as they are because you're going to be 5 years behind them, right? So I think you have to be careful about the choices, and you want to know who has sent other people out to faculty. Now, if you are a postdoc who wants to, and now if you're a junior faculty member and a postdoc comes to you and they're like, I know I don't want to go into academics, I want to go into industry, I just need to get some good papers or something, that's bonus, because then you get a postdoc who's got the experience already. They know how to do techniques, they know how to think, they're a good scientist, they've already had a lot of that training, but they're not going to compete to take something away from you. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I was not in a position to have a postdoc in my lab until I was an associate professor. I didn't have anything I could give away because I needed to write for those things. But graduate students were awesome because graduate students came in, they worked exactly on what I was working on, they generated data that helped me get my next grant, and then they went away to another postdoc and did whatever they wanted to do next. So I think who you mentor when in your career is a very important distinction. The other thing, which is maybe a little bit depressing for this audience to think about, is that truthfully my first hire was a staff member. And a staff member is a good hire because you're not paying tuition on them. And you're not, PhDs should get paid more than we do, frankly. But as a junior faculty member starting off, your budget is going to be tight. And so a dedicated staff member could be the most relevant hire. And I was lucky, I hired a lab manager my first year who stayed with me, who's retiring this year, who's been with me for 23 years now. That person has been my right arm throughout every, in fact, I like to tell the trainees, I was like, you are transient, she's staying, she gets to choose, So I think, thinking about who you hire, when and where makes a big difference. And also, as you're looking at labs to go to, if you're really wanting to do academics, you have to really have that hard conversation about whether that lab can support something that you can take with you. And that's going to be rare unless they are an associate professor or higher, for the most part. Yes?
So I'm looking at number 11, just have a plan but be flexible. Yeah, I guess the thing that I'm sort of mostly struggling with, I feel like, is trying to figure out how to distinguish myself from my PI. I mean, I'm sort of early on, so I've got time.
Postdoc or grad student, by the way?
Sorry?
Are you postdoc or grad? Postdoc, okay.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I guess being open to opportunity, but also being aware of sort of what your skill set coming is and like over diluting yourself and sort of finding your niche, I guess, is what I'm trying to figure out.
Well, I'll just tell you, I mean, I'm not sure I know perfectly how to answer it, but I'll tell you. So one strategy, it's funny, if you ask people if you should stay in the same field or change, can I ask, did you stay in the same field as your PhD or something quite different? Not really.
Yeah.
Okay. So some people will tell you that if it's bad to stay in the same field, you get all this diversity of ideas. That's all true. But the truth is that this knowledge that you accumulate in the field that you're working in it definitely is cumulative. And so people who kind of stay in something related and move from graduate school to postdoc and something sort of related, they know all the people in there. Those people make it faster. So Gary Huffnagel was an example. Gary and I were in graduate school together at the same time, but Gary made full professor about 7 years before I did, because he started off in crypto and he stayed in crypto and he did very well in there. So that's one thing. As far as differentiating yourself from the PI's lab that you're in right now, that I think it can be a couple of different things. I'll tell you where I finally got mine. So when I first came to Michigan and got a chance to write my first grant, I came to a lab that was working on chemokines and angiogenesis, and the lab was a lung cancer lab. That's how I got in the pulmonary division. And what I did different was do a lot of the same things, but I did it in a prostate cancer model. That was what made me different. So I still was publishing on lung cancer, but I started off over here on prostate cancer. And I gotta tell you, I went to grad school because I wanted to work on cancer. I was so excited when I got this job because it was a cancer job. And guess what? My PI left. And he went to UCLA and he didn't offer to take me with him. So there I was with and I did fortunately get a grant, but I had a grant to do prostate cancer, and I was a faculty member in the pulmonary division. And I remember my then division chief, Galen Taves, called me into his office and he's like, I don't care what you do with that grant, but it's got to do something related to the lung. You got to turn it around some way. And that was, so I had to be flexible, right? And then to be honest, I couldn't do lung cancer. Bob did lung cancer. He was going to UCLA. There was no way I was competing with him. So to be perfectly honest, that's why it's a grant, not a contract. We took the money from the grant and I started a chemokine project related to lung fibrosis. Nothing to do with what that grant was on. But that was the data that we generated. That became the CCR2 paper, and that launched my career. And guess what? I trained as an immunologist, and pulmonary fibrosis is a whole lot about macrophage, or about a little bit of macrophage, but a lot about fibroblasts and epithelial cells, so about which I felt like I knew this much about. But that was the direction the data needed to go. So that's what I mean by be flexible. So in trying to differentiate yourself from your current PI, I guess there's a couple of ways to do it. If you guys have done a big single-cell RNA-seq, is there a set of 10 genes that can be yours to follow up on, and he's got the other 500, or she? Is there a cell line that you can study that's different than this? Is there a mutation you can make that can be yours? Is there a protein that needs 4 different mutations studied? Can one of them be yours and 3 others be somebody else? That kind of thing. So I'm happy to talk afterwards about maybe specific ideas, but those are generally the kinds of things that you try to pivot. Or another great thing is like, let's say you're in like right now, immunometabolism is a super hot field right now, but we have metabolism experts at Michigan and we have immunology experts at Michigan. We don't have that many people that do immunometabolism, and so a student in our program right now that's working between 2 labs to kind of get that information, is creating a niche that might be considered a unique niche there. So it's that kind of thing. So if there's a collaboration or a technique that you can learn, something like that, that'll help differentiate you. But it's important because when you write these training grants, a big thing that they look for in these K22s, K01s, those kind of grants, is how do you make yourself something that's not a clone of your mentor. The NIH is not really interested in cloning, at least cloning us.
So I think you touched on the idea of collaboration a little bit just then. So what are some ways as a graduate student or a postdoc that you can practice collaborating so that you're better at it when you're a faculty? Yeah,
well, I think graduates, doing these kinds of things, you guys are actually the best at establishing collaborations because you reach out to, you go to your, picnic or whatever, you're talking, whatever, other people are doing, you ask them for help. This is the time to collaborate, and you should look around you because I cannot tell you how important people I went to graduate school with who did nothing, I think I've told some of you this before. When I finally got to the point that I wanted to study gamma or herpes viruses and fibrosis, I was thrilled to look in the literature and find out that somebody I went to graduate school with was working on gamma herpes viruses. She wasn't when we were in graduate school together, but that was like, hey, great, I can call up Linda Van Dyke and ask her to send me this virus, and that really worked well. So you will be amazed, keep up with these people around you because you'll be amazed at where these people go and what connections they'll have for you or who they'll know. They might be at the same university as somebody else you want to. So that kind of stuff is good. So these connections you're making right now are important. And you may not realize they're important for the next 20 years, but they will come back and be important. So stay in touch. That's one thing that I think is important. Then as far as collaboration, You guys are the best at it. You know, reach out, go to another lab, and then this is my thought, is if somebody comes to you and says, can you help me do, like, let's just give an example from my lab. My lab knows how to do t-SNE analysis of our flow cytometry data, does it fairly well. A lot of people come to us for that help. I mean, Steve Grzinski, who happens to be a junior faculty member in the lab, you know, and I were having this conversation, you know, how much is too much? You know, when do I say no to this? And I said, well, you know, if it seems like it's a collaboration that, you know, you might be able to get your name in the paper somewhere, you should say yes. If you teach them how to do it and then they don't take good notes and they come back to you to do the same thing again or whatever, then it's time to say no because they need to move it on. So what I would say is, you know, be willing to help people when they come to you. But if you're the person asking for collaborative help, you should go trying to learn how to do it yourself. I mean, or at the very beginning of the collaboration, you should set up and say, I'm not going to learn how to do this t-SNE myself. I'm going to give you 5 experiments. I anticipate if you do all 5 of these experiments, you'll be on the paper. But you're not going to have to teach me how to do it. I'm just asking you to do it for me. And then it's just a matter of trying to decide. I think in general, these collaborative papers, they come around and they help. It's going, I think on my CV, just because they made me do this for department chair, I think I have 180 publications right now. I think only 60 of those am I first or last author on. That means I have 120 publications where I'm somewhere in the middle. But you know what? When people look at my CV, they see 180 publications. They don't bother to go down and count that there's only 60 of them that are my primaries or whatever. So I think that helps. So I think if you can do a collaboration, help somebody else out, especially if there's a path to a publication, that is worth your time, for sure. But when you're the one asking, make sure you know whether you're asking them to do you a favor or whether you're asking them to teach you how to do something, in which case you do try to learn to do it yourself. Because it's very annoying for some, like, you know, for instance, bone marrow transplants. We just do bone marrow transplants for people because there's way too much regulatory stuff for them to learn how to do it themselves. So we just do it for them. But for t-SNE analysis, you know, if you come back to Steve and ask him to help you for the 5th time, he's getting really annoyed, I promise. Yeah. Hopefully that helps. Yes?
I have a related question. First of all, thanks for providing this comprehensive list. It's good to know all the things that one needs to succeed in science.
Oh, I don't know if I can guarantee it's that comprehensive.
I have one more thing that we hear a lot about these days, that is networking, and I have not figured out the best way to do that for academic jobs. And it was interesting that you mentioned that when you were in Stanford, somebody in your network told you about this position in Michigan. So as postdocs who are in the job market, what is the best way to do networking? Should we just go to conferences, talk to as many people as possible, or what should we?
Well, so I have 2 possible answers to that. First of all, I mean, I think it's always, if there's somebody at the conference that you would like to postdoc with, then you should definitely walk up to them and try to introduce them. I think if you go to a conference with no plan to try to meet someone in particular, that's not necessarily a good use of your time. I will tell you that faculty, I probably get 3 or 4 a week requests to be a postdoc in my lab. 95% of them I scan and ignore or write back and just say, I'm sorry, I don't have a position. The ones that make me stop and look are when they write to me and they say, you know, although my background is this, I've looked at your work, I'm very interested in this, or, you know, or I know I have this skill set that I think I could apply to this or something. So if you want to, I think what you want to do as a postdoc is you want to figure out what area do you want to be in for your faculty position. You know, if you want to do you need to go to a lab to learn how to, you know, I mean, and there's 2 things. You can either go to a lab to learn a technique that's going to help you address some question that you already know how to do from your graduate school, or you're going to a lab to learn how to do some new area of science, neuroscience. You know, you trained as a zebrafish person, now you want to go do, you know, mouse neuroscience stuff. And so you're really trying to make that pivot. I think if you write a thoughtful cover letter to the email, you can cold email, you know, somebody that you're interested in and see. Because if you write a letter where it's clear that you spent a little bit of time, you know what they're doing, you're making some suggestion about what skill you could bring to them, that's always somebody that I'll usually reach out to, and at least, I mean, if I can afford them at all, I usually at least try to reach out and try to talk to them about it. The other thing is, do not be afraid to use contacts here, your PI, people your PI know, to contact people for you. So I do this all the time for the graduate students that want to go postdoc for immunology. I will reach out, you know, even if I don't know them, I can send an email that says, I'm the grad director at Michigan, you know, I have a student who's great, really wants to do this. They're very interested in your lab. They're going to be contacting you this week. Please be looking for their email. So, you know, if you can call me to do that now if you want to. I mean, you know, really somebody like that can help you make those connections. So I don't think networking necessarily means that you have to physically talk to somebody like at a conference. You can talk to somebody next door to you who can help make that email introduction to help, you know, that happen. So
you'd say the same for faculty jobs, because these days I hear that there are 300 applications for one position, and if somebody knows people in that department, somehow, I mean, they feel more comfortable interviewing that person?
I think that's true. I think that when you've got 300 applications and you've sorted them and you have your top 10 or whatever that you're looking at, but somebody calls you about someone who's in the other pile, then you tend to make 11 slots so that you can look at that person too. So that is true. But what you've got to make sure that, and I think there's one of my points on there, make sure that the reputation you have right now is that you are collaborative, that you are hardworking, that you are a thoughtful scientist, that you know, show up, go to conferences, ask good questions. Make sure that when they call to give a recommendation for you, they're going to say things about you that are positive, you know. Because the other way happens too, right? People call, well, you know, really great scientist, but you know, super difficult to get along with, had a real problem with, you know, the technician in that lab, you know, never, you know, never cleans up their bench after themselves, you know, whatever it is. I mean, the bad stuff gets reported too. So I think your job now is to try to, you know, do your best to be your best professional self now, so that the references people will have about you will be the best possible references.
I think that gets into the point about being professional and kind. Is there any particular event during your the training part before you got to faculty that helped you understand better how to practice these skills of just being aware of different people or from different situations? Were there any, like, I guess that would go back to the extracurricular activities that helped you practice those skills before you came to faculty?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I did not get along well with my PhD mentor. We just were not, we didn't see eye to eye. Especially when I told her that I was pregnant. That did not go well. I think her exact words were, well, that's a mistake. You know, I guess you have to live with that now. I think so. So, you know, she was not, but she was a very good scientist, but she was not someone I liked. And I knew that I wanted to have a chance to have my own lab so that I could do it different, or try to do it different. Now, I've had 10 graduate students over the years. I've loved all of them. I thought I was doing my very best possible job, but I can tell you all of those two, except for maybe Helen and Melissa haven't been in my office yet, but over the years, I think all of the 8 that have graduated were in my office crying and furious with me about something at one point or another. So I still, you know, you still screw up, even though I think, you know, I've tried to be better than what I thought I had. You know, we just make mistakes. Human nature is different, and I can tell you that relationship, you know, my relationship with some of my female graduate students has been very different than some of my relationships with my male graduate students, just because the women tend to tell me more about their personal lives than the men did along the ways, and you know, they just develop these different relationships. All of it can work and all of it can be good, but it is all different. I mean, and there's definitely, you should just know, there's going to be ups and downs in any relationship. I mean, there is no perfect mentorship relationship, and there's no one person who can provide all of the mentoring that you need around every area. So you're really going to want to reach out to different people, and sometimes peer mentors are the best. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I will say right now, one of my hardest transitions right now is that Deneen Wellick, for those of you who knew Deneen Wellick when she was here, one of my dearest friends, and by far the woman that I went to all the time when I just needed to blow off steam or gripe about something, Deneen was my sounding board and I was hers. And she moved to Wisconsin, and I miss her like crazy, because that is such an important thing to have, is somebody who you can go say whatever you need to say to, who gets it, right? And so find amongst yourselves somebody who can be the one person who you can blow off steam to and you can gripe about, but that's not going to go tell 3 other people that you griped about, because you don't want that to spread, you know. So I think, you know, I think finding those kinds of, you know, whoever can be the right mentor for those things is important. Other than that, I mean, so my PhD mentor and I did not see eye to eye, but I appreciate her a lot now. She did teach me how to plan an experiment, how to design an experiment, and she was she did more for me than I realized at the time, because she demanded you do the work, and she was not going to take sloppiness. If it took you longer to do it, you needed to go back and redo it. I mean, all of those things I think are skills that have helped me be better now. Other than that, I think it's just from a lot of watching and hearing, watching people. You see what works and you see what doesn't work. But almost all mentoring issues can be boiled down to whether the communication is clear. It's everything that goes wrong is just a difference in expectation. And so if you have not done those kinds of more mentoring agreements, where I know they're like kind of tragically terrible to sit through and all, but there is something that's important about saying to your mentor, how many hours do you expect me to be in the lab? If I'm reading, do I have to be sitting at my desk? Or are you going to see that, or can I go to the library? If I leave the lab, do I need to tell you I leave the lab? If I'm not going to be in the lab on Friday, do I need to let you know ahead of time? Or is it just that flexible? And because the answer to that is very different depending on what lab that you work in. And so you just have to know what the expectation of your mentor is and what your expectation is. And then when it's different, I think usually most things can be solved when you go and say, I thought this meant this, or I was expecting this, and then you can usually work those things out. So almost all, as grad chair, almost all of the mentor-mentee, sorts of things, it's always just been, this is what's said. The mentor read it this way, the student read it this way, and they were just differences of opinion or differences in how they viewed it. So I don't know if that helps. You cannot be too clear.
How did you maintain a balance between your postdoc and your kids as you were having kids?
I am afraid that I am not the poster child for work-life balance. I think I said something on that. I mean, I will say, I just told you, I was not as successful a postdoc as I probably could have been. So, but I will tell you this, when I was a graduate student, I worked a lot of hours. I got in early, and we pretty much ate dinner together. We were there all day. We also didn't make enough money to go anywhere else, so we all just stayed there all the time. I worked a lot more hours as a graduate student, but I was a much more productive postdoc, because when I had children, I couldn't drop them off before 7:30, and I had to pick them up by 6. And so now my day got shortened, and I learned to be far more productive, because I couldn't just go get a cup of coffee and sit there and chat about whatever the news, NPR was, because I didn't have time to do that. I learned to calendar. I think I put this on. If you do not keep a calendar now, that is by far one of my most prominent pieces of advice. You should plan your experiments and write down. It happens a lot. I see this where there'll be a harvest, and if that harvest is going to take you 6 hours, you block off 6 hours on your calendar for that day, so that I can't start another experiment that's going to take 6 hours that day, or that's not going to work. And if you plan enough in advance so that you make sure that you've ordered the mice and they're here on time, and you've ordered the reagents you're going to need, and you've checked to make sure you have enough of the reagents you're going to need, and all those kinds of things, all of that stuff can really increase your efficiency. When I was a graduate student, it was not uncommon for me to go start an experiment and realize I didn't have the antibody I needed, or I didn't have the whatever I needed. I made those kinds of mistakes all the time. Then as a postdoc, I learned not to make those mistakes. And to be honest, between when my children were still tiny, we're still in kind of preschool ages, it was hard. I will not lie to you. I remember my husband and I sitting at a kitchen table one day and being like, okay, one of us is going to take one kid and one of us is going to take the other kid. There's no way we cannot keep this up. We just thought we could not manage. And a big difference for us was we just decided to go in debt to be able to pay for the daycare and stuff. We were trying. We just decided we finally got to the point we needed another car. We were trying to make it work on one car. It was like impossible. We did not have the money to buy another car, but we just did it anyway. And we just when I started my faculty position here, we had all kinds of debt. Because it was that, or we were going to divorce, because it was like impossible to do. When the kids were little, I tried very hard to, have dinner, go home and be for dinner. And then when the kids would go to bed, I stayed up and I read and did a lot of work I could at night. So I would love to tell you that when I went home at night, I never did any more work. That's not true. I always work at night. I still work on the weekends. I still work at night. But what I will say about science is that it's a flexible job. And there were definitely, what I tried to do was just when there was something, like when we went on vacation, I tried to go on vacation. When they had something that was important to do, I tried to do that. But I will tell you, I did not make every soccer game. I did not make every music practice. I did not get to everything, but I tried to do important things. And probably realistically, my work-life balance is 75 work, 25% home. When my kids were smaller, it was probably 60-40, maybe something like that. But then after the kids get older, this is another thing to remember, that time does change. There's a huge difference between what you can do when your kids are 5 versus when they're 12 versus when they're 25, you know, so that does change over the course of your career. So sometimes you just have to grin and bear it and get through it. And I do not have any magic words. I think the most important thing I wrote on there is, I think if you want a career in academics, I think what you have to say to yourself is, I refuse to quit. I'm not going to quit until they kick me out. And that's what I always said. I said, I'm going to sell shoes if they kick me out. But until they kick me out, I'm just going to do whatever it takes, right? Whatever grant, I mean, you just never shut the door. And I have to say, that's one thing as a grad director I've seen, is I see a lot of times people opt out before they try. They get scared. They think it's hard. There's nothing in life that's not hard. There's nothing in life that's worth having that's not hard. So don't opt out. Don't you yourself psych yourself out before you try it. I remember my dad gave me a piece of advice once. He said, if you're in the top 10% of anything, you usually can find a job. And that's what I've tried to be. And if you're at the University of Michigan as a graduate student or a postdoc, you have a very good shot at being in the top 10% of whatever you do. So just keep plugging. Don't quit. Yeah.
So once you became a faculty, did you have any wiggle room for actually doing independent research yourself, or that had to go out the door because of?
Oh, good question. You mean for me personally in the lab?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So for my first 3 graduate students, for better or worse, I was at the bench with them, day by day. I will say, even the whole time the whole time I was a research track faculty member, I didn't have any. I mean, I didn't get a graduate student until I was on the tenure track. So I was faculty here for 7 years before I was able to switch to the tenure track, and I didn't get a student until I had been here 8 years. So for those first 8 years, I was at the bench every day, working. For my first 3 graduate students, I would say I was working at the bench probably 50% of the time. But once I got to the point that I took over the immunology graduate program, it was really the administrative responsibilities that took me away from the bench. And so I have not worked at the bench in the last, say, 8 years, except that sometimes they let me come in and count differentials. Or I can still go in and help with a BAL if it's a big harvest day or something. But yeah, it's a very weird thing, is that there are people in my lab now do things that I don't know how to teach. And that's another, maybe one point I'll just touch on, is that, if you're trying to figure out, are you ready to go apply for faculty positions or whatever, what you have to be able to do is teach the people who you hire how to do your science. And so we've seen this go poorly with some hires here, and that sometimes we've hired some faculty who've come from big labs where they had a lot of help, a lot of sort of technical expertise help, and then they get here and they realize that, oh, you need that piece of equipment, I didn't put that piece of, you need to do that. They don't really know how to do their science. So one of the best things you can do is make sure that you physically know how to do your experiments, and you can physically teach somebody else how to do them. I think that's a major point in knowing if you're ready to transition.
I think one of the only points that we didn't touch on in some form or fashion was maybe knowing what your science costs.
Oh, yeah.
So what can you do as a trainee to prepare for having to write budgets and hire people?
Right. So I mean, I think in the one hand, it shouldn't be your responsibility so much at this point, but it is good to just know what science costs. Mouse work is extraordinarily expensive. If you're doing human work, actually, it's much cheaper, because a lot of times, you don't have to pay to get your samples and things like that. So you should just be aware. I mean, I think it's a good idea, maybe not even so much as a graduate student, but especially as you move into postdoc, to just realize a mouse costs $20, that a cage of 5 mice costs $1 a day. If I leave them sitting downstairs for 6 weeks before I start to do my experiment, that 6 times 7 is 42. That costs $42 times the 10 cages. Oh, whoops, that was $420, that we just spent. So I think it's a good idea to just sort of know what the cost of antibodies are and the things like that. And if you're in your 4th year of postdoc or whatever, you're really getting ready to transition, it's probably a good idea to start kind of keeping a log of just the general sorts of costs, because they're going to ask you to give them a list of what you want as a startup package. And there may be some general rules about it, but definitely you'll be able to justify certain things. And believe me, if you're doing a lot of mouse work or you have long experiments that have a lot of per diem and things like that, you may need to justify a little bit more money to get started. And so I think it's just a good idea to be cognizant of about what it costs. And then remember that whatever salaries, you know, graduate students make, you know, $30,000-ish a year, but then there's another, you know, $24,000 to $17,000 a year of tuition on top of that. You know, postdocs make, you know, let's say $50,000 a year, but then there's another 30% of that which is their benefits, which they should absolutely get, but then those come out of the direct costs of your lab. And so the truth of the matter is that what is hard today, and especially now that universities are causing PIs to put more of their own salaries on their grants, which is a big problem, but it's true today, a $250,000 R01 budget is probably enough to pay 30% of the PI salary, maybe a technician, and maybe one other person. You are not going to pay for more than 3 people on any one grant. And so if you think about what kind of size lab that you want to have, you have to start thinking about how many grants that takes to run. And if there's mouse costs on there, maybe you can only afford 2 people per grant. So I think it's just a good idea to sort of have some idea. I mean, a lot of times students say to me, they're like, oh, you know, if I could just get the 1 R01, that would be fine. But the truth of the matter is it's hard to run a lab on 1 R01. I mean, that is the truth. But it's so wonderful when you get one. The thrill of getting it makes it totally worth writing it. So don't be daunted. And there's a lot of university support for in between. That's the other thing is, I think you forget that, you know, there should be backup from your university. There should be bridging funds and things like that to help you get through the dips, because it is a cyclical thing.
And I think one final question in the last minute would be, what is the one thing that you wish you had better prepared for during your training stage for being a faculty member?
God, I wish I'd taken biostatistics. I wish I'd taken biostatistics. Right now, I wish I knew anything about coding. I think data science and that kind of stuff is like a big new area, so I think you guys should train for that. And the one thing that I'm lousy at that I wish I had had better practice at is I have a hard time having a difficult conversation with somebody. You know, telling somebody that they're not working hard enough, or telling somebody that they're, you know, that they've disappointed you or whatever, or why, or so those are difficult conversations. And the HR piece of running a lab can be very, you know, like I said, I've had my technician for 22 years, but she's definitely got a big personality. And, you know, like trying to mediate her personality versus other people in the lab, I've really done that fairly terribly sometimes. So.
Okay, I think that's everything. Leslie, thank you.
Yeah.